On today's podcast for Inquiry, I speak with Andrew Seidel about his book, The Founding Myth. We begin our conversation with the birth of the United States and its founding documents. We trace how America was not intended in any way to be a Christian nation, and how a significant portion of its populace came to believe that that was not the case. We also talk about contemporary America, including the very real threat that Christian nationalists pose to American democracy. Andrew is an author and attorney who's defended the First Amendment for more than a decade, both in and out of court. Andrew has dedicated his career to challenging religious privilege and battling Christian nationalism. I'm very proud to bring you my conversation with Andrew Seidel. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Andrew Seidel, welcome to Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I'm very excited for this conversation, and I'm going to try and keep this to under 12 hours because I just have so many questions and things I want to go through. But I think the main topic of the book is, I think, an important one, and it's your book, The Founding Myth. And the subtitle is Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. And I think that's going to come as a surprise to many people because I'm hearing more and more, like in the past 5 years, that America is a Christian nation has been a rallying cry that is increasing in both frequency and fervency. So why don't we start right with the thesis of your book, and to those people who insist that indeed America is a Christian nation, why do you think they are so very wrong?
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of the central question. And I think, for a long time, this question was treated as a historical debate, as a historical inquiry. Like, was America actually founded as a Christian nation? What did our founding fathers intend? What did they mean? What did they include in the Constitution? But the reality is that there's not really much of a historical debate about this. And when you get into the claims that these Christian nationalists, right, those who are claiming we were founded as a Christian nation, these Christian nationalists are making, you find out that they have a set stable of myths that they turn to make this claim. And when you peel back the layers and look at the historicity, nothing is on their side when it comes to that. And so the next question or the next thing that we have to add, we can't just leave it there. We can't just be content to rebut the historical disinformation that they have and that they are putting out there in the ethos. We have to ask ourselves, well, why is this happening? Why are they so intent on pushing this historical disinformation and trying to have this debate? And I think the best example of why is what we saw happen on January 6th here in the United States. It's not often that you choose a subtitle for a book, right? Christian Nationalism is Un-American is the subtitle. And then the subject runs out and tries to prove you right? It's pretty rare that you are that lucky as an author. But, shortly after the book was published, Christian nationalists attacked American democracy. And they attempted to overturn the results of a free and fair election. And they proved beyond all doubt that Christian nationalism is un-American. So while this debate was treated for a long time as this legitimate historical debate, we saw on January 6th that Christian nationalism ripped off its mask and showed that it's not a scholarly debate about how America was founded. It is a violent exclusionary movement bent on seizing power in the here and now.
But when I look at American media, I hear, or at least some of it, a subset of American media, the the protesters of January 6th were simply having a political rally, and those that have been arrested, and these they are patriots who are being held hostage in America's judicial and penal system. So,
Yep.
so that doesn't seem to be at least a universal consensus that the events of January 6th were in fact an attack on America or on democracy. They were in fact trying to preserve it, if they are to be believed.
And that's Christian nationalism at work. It truly is. And if you can actually look at the evolution of that treatment of the January 6th insurrectionists over time, from the day of live as it was happening to now, and see the shift that has happened on the right when it comes to those insurrectionists. But let's look at what actually happened. Paula White began that day with a prayer, and in true Christian nationalist fashion, she added the United States of America to the Lord's Prayer, which is written down in Matthew 6, right? So she added America to a prayer that, according to the Bible anyway, Jesus himself wrote and prescribed and crafted this prayer, right? And it's amazingly, it's in the same chapter where Jesus tells people to pray in private, not in public, for instance, on a stage on the National Mall, to pray in private, not like the hypocrites praying in public that they may be seen by others. So it begins with a prayer, and then it ends with Trump calling on his mob to march to the Capitol. His last words are the words that Nixon uses to distract the country from the Watergate scandal. God bless you and God bless America. Nixon doing that at the Watergate scandal was the first time an American president ever used those words to end a speech. Impromptu worship concerts broke out on the short walk. On their march to the Capitol, the Proud Boys were hailed as God's warriors. They knelt in a prayer that was full of typical Christian nationalist rhetoric about restoring the nation. Right? They marched and then they attacked. And one attacker carried a Christian flag onto the floor of the Senate. Right, we all know and saw the absurdly self-proclaimed QAnon shaman leading a prayer on the dais of the Senate, about a prayer about patriotism and Jesus and restoring the nation and ending it in Jesus's name. One of the praying insurrectionists gave an interview later and talked about the prayer and said of the Senate, quote, "We consecrated it to Jesus, and that to me is the ultimate statement of where we are in this movement." And it is. And there was a third praying insurrectionist who just wanted to get inside the blood in the building so he could plead the blood of Jesus over it. And he spends 40 minutes recounting every action that he took and attributing it to Jesus. And then my favorite was there was one insurrectionist who filmed herself afterwards, and she's sipping a post-assault beer, and she told her social media followers why she attacked American democracy. She said, "To me, God and country are tied. To me, they're one and the same. We're founded as a Christian country, and we see how far we have come from that. We're a godly country founded on godly principles." And that's why I wrote The Founding Myth, right? Because none of what she's saying is true. But that belief that she is espousing there, that she is saying, and that you're talking about, right? That these are the true patriots. That belief is why they felt like they had a right to attack our democracy and try to undermine a free and fair election. Christian nationalism provided, and the myths of Christian nationalism provided the permission structure that they needed to attempt to overturn a free and fair election. And I mean, providing that permission structure is just like one of the most crucial aspects of what is happening in America and American politics right now that people desperately need to understand.
All right, so we need to establish how we got here, and let's spend a few minutes doing that. And you mentioned the evolution over time, so let's go back to the beginning of the United States as a modern country. And when we think about its founding, or at least when I think about its founding, I think of three documents, or what I thought was three documents. There was the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and then the Bill of Rights. And I have to confess that I didn't realize that the Bill of Rights was just the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. I thought it was a separate thing until I read your book and started looking up these things. So really, we're looking at two documents. We're looking at the Declaration of Independence and then the U.S. Constitution, along with all of its 27, I believe, amendments. Mm-hmm. And when I read the Declaration of Independence, that's in 1776, there's a lot of religious rhetoric in there. It strikes me as that. Like there's references to nature's God and the creator, the supreme judge of the world and divine providence. Now, these are not explicitly Christian, although they're very consistent with Christian rhetoric. But if that's not religious wording and references, I'm not sure what is. So when we're talking about the founding, for now, let's just talk about the Declaration of Independence. Doesn't that imply sort of a religiously infused declaration?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And of course, Christian nationalists love to focus on those four mentions. And as you know, because you read The Founding Myth, I spend a whole chapter going over each and every one of those mentions. But the Declaration begins when, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station. Right? It is clearly talking about the here and now, about human events, about one people, the powers of the earth. Right? It is not truly concerned with the divine. What it is concerned with is natural law. That is a big piece of the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, there are kind of two major principles that we can pull from that document: that power comes from the people, and that people have a right to rebel against tyrannical rule. Now, again, I look at each one of the references that you mentioned in the book and go over them and kind of, again, show one, that they're not Christian, that they're, at the very most deistic or possibly theistic. But if you look at the two major principles that are in the Declaration, that power comes from people and that people have a right to rebel against tyrannical rule, both of those principles are contradicted in the Bible. I mean, like absolutely contradicted in the Bible. And then there's, of course, the overarching reliance on natural law. And this is partly where things also get confusing, because the Declaration does invoke natural law, but it doesn't invoke a Judeo-Christian God. And there is, for people who may not be familiar with natural law, it's kind of the idea that there is a universal law, that there are legal and moral principles that can be derived from a more universal law. And that's either a conception of human nature or something divine. Right? So there's two competing views of natural law, one that's founded on the universal human nature and one that's founded on divine justice. And we know that Jefferson, when he was writing this, invoked the former. He invoked the idea of a natural law based on human nature. And we know that because he wrote about it repeatedly. And for instance, he wrote in 1793 in his opinion on the French treaties that questions of natural right, we're talking about natural law there, questions of natural right are triable by their conformity with the moral sense and reason of man. And then he wrote in a summary view of the rights of British America, which was just a couple years before the Declaration, he said that a free people claiming their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate, right? He's talking, and then he goes on to say, asserting the rights of human nature. Right. So what he is saying, and what the Declaration says, is that we have rights by virtue of being human. And I think that's really actually crucial, that rights are bestowed, not bestowed, not even by kings. Rights are asserted, not given. Rights come from human nature, not divine nature. Jefferson even talks about it as being the product of liberal and expanded thought. Right, not the product of religion or of churches or of the Bible. And the crucial point for me here is that is what we are talking about is the difference between God-given rights and human rights. Rights that we have by virtue of being human, or rights that are handed down and dictated by people claiming to speak for God.
So those that are claiming that the Declaration is a religious document are just quote mining and are refusing to, not engaging in it in good faith. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the Constitution. Now, you argue in your book that it is a godless document, and that you mean that literally, in that God is not mentioned in the Constitution, and I've read it now, and I agree. And that the only references to religion in the Constitution are negative, in the sense that you can't have a religious test for public office. You can't have the government interfering with religious worship. Um, but I've been following the news in the United States, and it seems like these rules prohibiting. Sorry, I should also say that you can't have, in addition to prohibiting government interference with religious worship, it also prohibits religious interference with the government. So these are all restrictions on government and religion. But it seems to me, following the last, even, I don't know, 40 years in the United States, that these constitutional rules are honored more in the breach than the observance.
Yeah,
Uh,
I would certainly say that we've taken it for granted. We've taken the separation of church and state for granted, and we're paying the price for that right now. Americans are waking up to what it is like to live in a country without that separation more and more every day, and not coming to regret it quite enough, or not connecting a lot of what's happening. For instance, the overturning of Roe versus Wade to the fact that the wall of separation between church and state has been eroded.
so how so help me out here. You are
Yeah.
a U.S. constitutional scholar, and I am neither a lawyer, and I'm not even an American. I try and stay informed, but I'm not an expert. But how strong is the federal constitution? So, as written, it says, and I'm going to quote here. I wrote this down: "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States." And that's pretty clear language, even to a non lawyer
Yeah.
like myself.
Yeah.
But the constitutions of 7 or 8 states bar atheists from holding public office,
Hmm.
and this was struck down as unconstitutional. They weren't officially rendered moot, these prohibitions, until 1961. So it was nearly 200 years where these these prohibitions in several U.S. states stood despite the clear language of the federal Constitution. So, is like how strong is it in the United States to have a federal Constitution that is in a sense violated by states at will?
A couple different thoughts on that. One is a lot of the language in both the federal and state constitutions is aspirational, and it's as aspirational, and we've failed as a people to achieve it. Right? We, the people, are the first words of our constitution, and they're poetic. They're an aspiration, and they're one that we haven't reached. Equal justice under law, which are the words that are carved into our Supreme Court. We've failed to reach that. So I think one is that important point. But let's talk about the federal Constitution, the United States Constitution, for a second, because
Mhm.
you're absolutely right, and you're touching on a couple different things that I think are important there. And it's the first is that the wall of separation between church and state is an American original, right? That is an American invention. The idea was definitely out there. It was floating around in the Enlightenment. There were religious leaders, Roger Williams, for instance. There were political thinkers who had batted this idea around, but it was first implemented in the American experiment. Until then, no other nation in the history of the world had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely by separating religion and government. We should be proud of that as Americans. And I don't think we should let people undermine it with myths about a Christian founding. And if you look at the U.S. Constitution, there's a lot that's wrong with it, and I will be the first to admit that there's a lot that's wrong with it. But and I say that as a constitutional scholar, right? But if you look at the truly unique and the truly original elements of our Constitution, they're secular. Our Constitution was the first to declare that power comes from the people, not the gods, right? Those words that I just said, we the people, they are poetic, but they are much more. They are a declaration of power, in addition to being an aspiration. Our Constitution was the first not to mention a god or a deity. And it's godless by choice, not by accident, which I think is a crucial distinction, right? Like, there were people in the founding generation who objected to the fact that God was not in the U.S. Constitution. And then you already mentioned the language in Article 6, but it's worth harping on that, because that was the only mention of religion in the original unamended document, right? And that ban on religious tests that you read, and the language there is clear and emphatic And it's clear and emphatic in a document that is often deliberately vague. So one of the things that every American social studies student learns is that the Constitution kind of laid out a framework or an outline, and that later generations were going to come along and fill it in. But and that means necessarily having a lot of vague and nebulous language. But not in Article 6, Clause 3. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office. No, shall, ever, any, right? Like it's clear, emphatic, and broad. And then, even after all that, then you get the First Amendment, which separates church and state and guarantees religious freedom and says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So again, there's a whole lot that's wrong with our Constitution. But those secular foundations are what made it unique. And they're genuine contributions, not just to political science and thought, but to all humanity. And several states also tried to do the federal model when it was first kind of put into practice. Some of them, as early as 1776, kind of thought about really trying to promote this experiment with church-state separation, and in kind of some ways did that in their state constitutions, but they still had established churches often. And as we progressed past the ratification of the Constitution, the proposal 1787, ratification 1789, Bill of Rights 1791. As we get farther and farther from that time, the states are looking and seeing the success of the federal model and seeing how it does guarantee people true religious liberty by separating church and state. And one by one, all of the states begin to disestablish their churches too. So by 1834, there's no established church in the United States. And I say all that to point out that, like, yes, we by no means succeeded in this experiment right off the bat. We got the idea right, but implementing it is hard. And we've not been able to fully do that. And it is an aspiration. And when we fall down in separating religion and government and keeping those two entities apart, right, we inevitably see the rollback of rights and freedoms all across the board.
Let me compare and contrast Canada and the United States. So Canada mentions God. God, keep our land glorious and free. Mm-hmm. This was added to the national anthem, the original, the English version anyway. The original lyric was simply, "Oh, Canada, glorious and free." But we put "God, keep our land glorious and free." We replaced the British North America Act, which was essentially our founding document, with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1989. And in the preamble of the Charter, we mentioned the supremacy of God. Now, subsequent Supreme Court rulings have said that it's in the preamble that has no legal weight, but it's there. So if you look at Canada, on our symbolism and in our Constitution, we look to be very much like a God-fearing country. And if you look at the founding documents of the United States, you would draw just the opposite conclusion. Now, if you look at Canadian politicians, we definitely have believers, even devout believers, in our government and in leadership positions. But their public personas are quiet about it. It's deemed gauche or even rude to go on and on about one's faith as you're running for office. Like, do whatever you want privately, but
Sounds
nobody.
Wonderful.
But there are very few that put their faith on their sleeve and say, "This is you should elect me because I am devout, Christian or Muslim or Hindu or whatever." And I look into the United States, I don't know if, like, maybe from a couple state elections in New York and California, but federally and throughout most of the country, it certainly appears to me that you cannot get elected unless you are very publicly pious and devout and God-fearing and God-worshiping, regardless of what is the formal structures that were attempted. So I'm wondering if you can comment on sort of the contrast between our two countries, which are very similar demographically, very similar culturally, but very, very different in this respect.
Yeah, and it goes to what we were just talking about with having that separation of religion and government and abolishing those established churches, and it's a couple different things, but really, there's this ostensible paradox of church-state separation, right? This idea that, like, well, why is it that in the country that invented the separation of church and state, you have so many different believers and that are so very, very fervent? You would think that people would move away from religion. And then why is it in countries like Canada and England and the rest of Great Britain, like, you have these established churches and nobody goes to church? And it seems to be this contradiction for folks. But if you tease it out and you think about it, that is what you would predict, and that's what actually makes sense. And Adam Smith, the famous economist, he kind of predicted this actually in 1776. James Madison also predicted it. I think it was back in like 1819 or so. And it's because of capitalism. If you think if you make the capitalism analogy and think of religion as a marketplace and churches as a marketplace, right? If you have a state-imposed monopoly, right, there's no competitors. Taxes support the church. The priests or preachers or clergy, that clergy class doesn't have to do anything to maintain their followers, maintain their status in society, right? They're entitled to their flock. They're entitled to their tax dollars. They're successful without any effort. But in countries where you have a separation of church and state, where you have freedom of worship, you have effectively a religious marketplace, which has been likened by many folks to a jungle, right? So you have this jungle-like market, which ensures that the only religions that are going to survive are the ones that are going to be best at attracting and keeping their members, right? It's a survival of the fittest type thing. So in the wild marketplace that the separation of church and state creates, you have this greater proportion of religions that are attracting people, as opposed to kind of the entitled version that you get in places with an established church. And that is why I believe that you see what you were talking about, the phenomenon that you're talking about of this sort of voter imposed auto de fe on all of our political candidates, right? Like, yes, the Constitution bans religious tests for public office, but we're not going to vote for anybody who we don't think is religious because they're an immoral baby eater, even though that's 100% wrong.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about morality. I'm going to quote from your book again. The United States was created by Christians for Christians because only they are moral. That Christianity is required for a moral society. You're paraphrasing, or you're stating the outlook of the Christian Nationalists. You're not speaking for yourself.
Yes. Just to be clear to everybody listening,
that's
not me.
No. You wrote those words, but you're describing someone else.
Yes.
I wish I could look down upon you from on high up here in Canada, and say that we don't have such an attitude up here. But it was precisely that attitude that led to Canada forcibly removing Indigenous children from their families and communities, and our stated purpose was to civilize the savage. And you do that through Christianization. So this isn't something you deal with in your book, but I'm curious because I would like to know, was the U.S. treatment of its Aboriginal peoples inspired by Christian righteousness? And was that one of the major factors in, both of our countries' horrific treatment of the Native peoples?
Yes, it certainly was. And in fact, also slavery too. You definitely see this element of bringing Christianity to the, quote, savages, their word, not mine, from the first settlement of the United States. In one of the, I talk about the Pilgrims and the Puritans and how, I write about them in the Founding Myth, and how there's this kind of myth that they came to the United States for religious freedom, which is not true. They fled religious persecution. True. But that's not the same thing as coming to find religious freedom, because when they got here, they instituted their own like terrible little theocracies and were even more vicious about enforcing religious uniformity than where they fled from, which is actually not England but Holland. Anyway, in that chapter I write a little bit about the war that the Puritans waged against the Pequots, right? That this holy war, setting fire to a village on the Mystic River. I think they killed something like 700 indigenous men, women, and children. They sold the survivors into slavery. I mean, this is like something out of the book of Joshua. And the Puritans saw it that way. So I quote one of the militia commanders in there who talked about how God is up above watching this slaughter and making them or putting these indigenous folks into a, quote, fiery oven. And that was how the Lord judged the heathens, right? I mean, and then that's it is. And then I write in the chapter on slavery, I write how a lot of slaveholders justified what they were doing. They got the permission structure, the moral permission that they needed to enslave another human being by saying, we are bringing them to Christianity, we are civilizing them. It was a crucial part of justifying that evil in their own minds, right? And this is kind of a thread that runs throughout not just American history, but human history. And it's using religion as a permission structure to do what we would consider to be like clearly evil things, like slavery and genocide. So I do think that is an absolute part, and you see it in things like Manifest Destiny and the doctrine of discovery. Certainly, like the history of the missions out in the American Southwest and in Mexico are, absolutely shocking. And I do have an idea there have been some other scholars who have done a much better job of writing those things up. I have an idea of collecting some of that stuff, but it does appear in a couple disparate places in the founding myth. And I even get into it a little bit in my latest book, American Crusade, though only a touch.
You also wrote, I learned a lot from your book. A lot of what was in there were topics that I was passingly familiar with, but I learned a lot more depth from it. So if you haven't read The Founding Myth, I do recommend it. But there was one thing in there that I had never heard of and didn't know at all. It was a big eye opener for me, and that was the Treaty of Tripoli. And you write that it was signed by President Adams with the unanimous consent of the entire Senate, I think it was, or it was the House of Congress.
The Senate.
But what I remember is that the treaty reads in part, the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. So that's a pretty strong statement to be signed by the president and all the senators. Can you tell me what the Treaty of Tripoli was? Establish the context for why this is an important statement. Because if I don't know the Treaty of Tripoli, I can say, fine, it doesn't matter that it says that's not an important document. But I get the sense that it is. So please educate me on that, and our listeners as well, who may not know what the Treaty of Tripoli is.
Yeah, this stemmed out of our war with the Barbary pirates, who were wreaking havoc with not just American ships, but many different ships off the coast of Africa, impressing those sailors, enslaving those sailors, and we, the United States, enter into a treaty with them, and that treaty is negotiated under President George Washington. And the negotiated language that they come up with is pointing out that the United States is, as you quoted, not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, which is, that's a pretty clear statement. And then, as you said, ratified by the entire Senate unanimously, and then signed by Adams. Now, not a central point of the treaty, but I like it, one, because it's a clear statement. It's admirably clear. Two, because, and this is something that people who regularly use the Treaty of Tripoli, and there are a lot of folks who do this online, should pay attention to. It's not just John Adams. It's not just George Washington, and you'll see it variously attributed to both of those. It was effectively all of the government at the time agreed with this sentiment, right? I mean, it's a big difference to say that it was negotiated under Washington, unanimously agreed to by the Senate, and then signed by Adams. I think that those are important distinctions. But really, the point that I want to make when I bring it up in the founding myth is that this is clear and this is important and it's a good talking point. But it's actually the separation of church and state is woven into the fabric of our Constitution. It's not just in the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, or even the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, or the ban on religious tests in Article 6, right? Like from the beginning, where it says "we the people" until the end, that separation is woven into the fabric of our Constitution, and the entire structure of our government is based on that separation. So while those are like really useful pieces of language, and they can be effective for debating, including online, I tend to think that there are better arguments for it, and this is really what I tried to do in the founding myth. Is that Christian nationalism is fascinating to me because it is an entire identity that is based on disinformation. Right? Like it is this entire identity that people have and that they hold and that they believe in their deepest bones to be true, that is based on lies and on myths. And that is, I mean, that's truly remarkable if you think about it. And I mean, given some of your listeners and the work that we do, like maybe it's not as remarkable, and people have heard the disinformation before many, many times, that we are one nation under God and in God we trust. And the Declaration of Independence references the Christian God 4 different times, as we talked about at the beginning, right? And that they prayed at the Constitutional Convention, and George Washington knelt in the snow at Valley Forge and prayed, and that our laws are based on the 10 Commandments and the Bible and the Golden Rule, none of which is true. But without their origin myths, their identity withers. So this is why it's fascinating to me, and this is why I wrote the founding myth. Their entire political and ideological reality is vulnerable because it's based on disinformation.
Right. So you made a statement just now that I want to come back to, because you talked about the 10 Commandments, and our last episode was actually about the American Humanist Organization. I know that's not your organization. When you wrote this, you were at the Freedom From Religion Foundation, and now you're at Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, both good organizations. But you mentioned the 10 Commandments, and that's been in the news in the last few years. There's monuments that are trying to be erected or are being erected in front of courthouses, in front of state legislatures. And you write in your book, and I'm going to quote you here, every one of the 10 Commandments would be considered unconstitutional. Every single one, including the commandments against killing and thievery. And you go through every one in the book. But when I read that statement, before you got into that, I found that to be an incredibly bold claim, because as far as I'm aware, and again, not a lawyer, not even an American, as far as I'm aware, murder and stealing are illegal. And to the best of my knowledge, those laws have passed constitutional muster. So I don't want to go through all 10, but can you explain how the commandments, the 2 commandments against killing or murder, depending on your translation, and stealing, thievery, are unconstitutional in the United States of America?
Yeah, well, here's what I will do, because I want people to also go get the founding myth and read it. I don't care if you buy it, which my publisher really, if they hear this, I'm going to get an email or a call from them. But I just want people to read it. Go to your library. Go support your public library.
It is a good book. I have read it, and I recommend it. If you're interested in this topic, do read it, because you will learn a lot, even if you are already reasonably well informed.
And so one of the things I always do is I leave that as a hook that like people have to go read. But I will talk about this pretty extensively. I'm not going to give the full game away. I'm going to make people go read for you to give you the most specific answer. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true, of course, that some of the 10 Commandments overlap with criminal laws that prohibit murder and theft and perjury, like including wherever people are listening. But first of all, those rules are not exclusive or original to Judeo-Christianity, right? Those are universal human principles that every successful society we know of has adopted on their own. And this is the closest I will get. There's really compelling evidence that suggests the biblical version of those universal prohibitions was not universal. In other words, it's very hard to credibly claim when you get into it that the biblical iterations of those universal rules influenced the founding of the United States of America, whatever you do. And the rest of them really are downright un-American. I mean, it's very, very clear to make that case. I'm very comfortable with that bold language that I used, and I want everybody to go read it. But like, the Ten Commandments begin, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. And that is a divine command that embodies principles which directly conflict with the principles that you and I have been talking about, the principles on which the United States was founded, right? No law can tell an American to worship a god, let alone which god. We are free to be godless, as a growing number of us are, or if American wishes, they can worship every god out of every holy book or something in between. And the commandments continue in this un-American vein. They prohibit free expression and art, right? Graven images or idols. They prohibit free speech, taking the Lord's name in vain. They sanction slavery twice, which most people don't realize, that the Ten Commandments allow slavery twice, in Exodus 20:10 and Exodus 20:17. And you'll see that language gets changed often or omitted often from those stone monuments that you were talking about. The Ten Commandments promise to punish innocent children to the third, quote, this is a quote, to the third and fourth generation if the parents are brazen enough to exercise that religious freedom that is guaranteed in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And then you got the 10th commandment, which is like maybe the worst. It condones slavery, it treats women as chattel, and it criminalizes thought. And again, I find it fascinating. And, as you and I are interviewing right now, actually, the Louisiana Senate, so the state of Louisiana, the Senate is debating and likely going to pass a law which will require the Ten Commandments to be displayed in every public school, every private school, and every college or university that accepts any public money in the state of Louisiana. And again, those
Wow.
the monuments they lay out in that bill, and the monuments that you see carved in stone, for instance, at the Austin Capitol in Texas or in Denver at the Capitol, they edit out those horrific parts that I mentioned.
Are they going to include the commandment against adultery? Because I remember as a kid asking what that was, and that there was a lot of dodging and weaving.
Yeah.
If they're going to put that in primary schools, are they going to include that, or will it be one of my favorite scenes in all of movie history is Mel Brooks. And Mel Brooks is playing Moses, and he's he's carrying very awkwardly in his two arms the 3 stone tablets, and he says to the Jews huddled at the base of the mountain, "I bring you the 15 commandments." And then he juggles, and then one of the stone tablets falls, and he clutches the other two, and he says, "I bring you the 10 commandments."
It's an iconic moment. One of my favorite. I was actually able to work that in too, which is one of my prouder moments just as a writer. And I got to use the phrase "Brooksian recklessness," which was also nice. This is the question you ask overall is really, really crucial because
are they going to discuss adultery with primary aged students? I mean, because it's usually the people that are pushing Christian morality that are steadfastly against even age appropriate sex education. So I'm curious: are they going to include adultery in primary schools in Louisiana?
Well, yes, and what they have done is they have written out a state-approved version of the Ten Commandments, right? So you have the state dictating what Holy Writ says. They quote what in the law, in the text of the law, what the Ten Commandments display should say.
Wow.
Yeah, so you have the government editing Holy Writ according to, which every believer in the country ought to object to, right? Like you have the government telling you what the proper version of the Ten Commandments is, and it does omit a lot of that language that I mentioned. And it also, this is one of the first questions we always have to ask when we're talking about the Ten Commandments is, well, which 10 are we talking about? Which is kind of the question you're asking right now, because there are different versions of the Ten Commandments in any given Bible. In fact, there are 4 different sets in any given Bible. There's one in Exodus 20, another in Exodus 34, Deuteronomy 5, and another in Deuteronomy 27. 4 different sets in any given Bible. And those all have different translations. The first set that we think of as the Ten Commandments, thanks to Charlton Heston, right? Like those aren't even called the Ten Commandments in the Bible. It's the second set, which ends, "Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk." And they mean baby goat there, which is, but like that's the actual Ten Commandments according to the Bible. But we don't. It's amazing. And then there are different interpretations and different numberings. The Catholics number it differently and these seem like small differences, but there's no such thing as a small religious difference, right? The difference between killing and murder is a huge difference. I mean, the difference between graven images and idols, which I mentioned earlier, right, that actually split Christendom. There was a civil war in Christendom in the 8th and 9th centuries called the iconoclast controversy over which interpretation there was correct. This is why we have the word iconoclast today. So there's having the government weigh in on that religious interpretation and putting its stamp of approval on and saying this is the truth when it comes to this holy book or this interpretation is flat out wrong, and it's something that everybody ought to oppose.
Right. So that I mean, you've brought us right up to the contemporary age. I want to go back just a little bit in time, just a few years to, and I want to talk about the Attorney General of the United States, who is the role of the Attorney General of the United States is essentially the foremost law enforcement officer in the country. And Bill Barr, who at the time was the Attorney General of the United States, he gave a speech, and I want to give you two quotations from that. He says, these are the bitter results of the new secular age. Suffice it to say that the campaign to destroy the traditional moral order has brought with it immense suffering, wreckage, and misery. And he also said that the problem is not that religion is being forced on others. The problem is that irreligion and secular values are being forced on people of faith. Now, you talk a lot about in your book the separation of church and state, but you don't really talk about secularism, which is my favorite topic, and I look at it as the government neutrality in matters of religion more so than just the separation of church and state, although you come to much the same conclusions most of the time between those two. But how secular or how distinct can church and state be when the chief law enforcement officer of the country is basically saying that it's causing the country's collapse, it's bringing immense suffering, wreckage, and misery, which means that if he's an all immoral person and that's his belief, he's going to tear down that wall, to quote another Republican president in a different context.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've seen them working to tear down the wall of separation between church and state for decades now, and piece by piece, with significant help from the 6 ultra conservative justices on the Supreme Court. They've seen great success in that endeavor. I mean, it goes to it's not. I'm tempted to say it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the separation of church and state, but it's not, because Bill Barr is not stupid and he knows the difference. It's rhetoric. I mean, the point is to spread that disinformation and to show or to taint the idea of the separation of church and state in people's minds. And the reason that they have to tear down that wall, that founding American principle, that American original, the separation of religion and government, is because they cannot succeed in achieving their vision of a Christian nation when there is a separation of church and state. Right? Christian nationalism is the plague on American democracy right now, and the separation of church and state is the cure. And they know that. That's why they've had their sights set on it for the past 4 decades. And until this country begins to realize that and stand up and not just value, but truly defend the separation of church and state, we're not going to be able to defeat Christian nationalism and push it back to the fringe whence it came. And I mean, Bill Barr has been a prime mover in the Christian nationalist movement for a very long time. I'm pretty sure that speech that you cited was his Notre Dame speech that I wrote about at the time. Yeah.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, I mean, and that kind of disinformation is part and parcel to it, right? The separation of church and state is what guarantees Bill Barr's right to have his religious views. Right, the striking and amazing diversity of all the way from the most conservative evangelical Christian all the way up to the dyed in the wool atheist, that exists because of the separation of church and state in this country. And for folks like Bill Barr to succeed, they really have to turn that on its head. They have to say that separation is not in the Constitution, or that it's a threat to people's liberty. And nothing could be further from the truth. It is the only true guarantee for religious freedom that we have in this country. There is no freedom of religion without a government that's free from religion.
You write elsewhere that the greater the faith, the more subordinate healthy skepticism becomes. And you wrote in the context in which you wrote that sentence is in Trump's blind followers. But I think it's true more generally. The more committed a person is to any given ideology, the less critical thinking they do or possibly even can do about that subject. So my question to you is secularism, is this belief in the separation of church and state that you so strongly defend, is that just another religion, as Bill Barr avows it is, that you're not thinking critically, you're not being rational, you're just defending your faith and trying to impose it on him? And he might admit, fine, he's trying to impose his faith on you, but he's just doing the same thing that you are. What distinguishes you, Andrew Seidel, from Bill Barr or from the legislature of Louisiana?
I think an example is really helpful here, and an example that I've had good success persuading even people who disagree with me on is the example of a high school football coach here in the United States at a public school. Okay, so this is a person who is an agent of the state. They are employed by the state, and their job is to coach these kids. And if Bill Barr is that football coach or is guiding that football coach, Bill Barr wants that football coach to huddle those kids up before the game and say, okay, kids, we're going to pray to Jesus. Jesus is our Lord and Savior. He's going to guide our hands in this game. He's going to give us a bunch of touchdowns. He's going to tear the ACLs of our opponents. Right? He is going to make us win. Let's pray in his name and get out there and win. In his name we pray. Amen. That's imposing one particular religious belief using the machinery of the state, right? Using the power and position of that coach to impose one religion on other people's kids who may or may not be religious, who may or may not be Christian, who may not be religious at all, right? Who might be Jewish. That is a problem. That violates every one of those students' religious freedom, and it violates the separation of church and state. Now, what you're suggesting and what Bill Barr is arguing I would do if I were in that situation is I would huddle those kids up and say, okay, kids, there is no God. We're going to go out and eat baby after our game, but right now there is no God. Do your best to go out there and win, but there is no God, right? I'm using my position and power to impose my personal religious beliefs, lack of religious beliefs, on those kids. That's a problem. Now, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've received thousands and thousands of complaints from people across the country. I've heard many complaints of coaches imposing their Christianity on other people's kids. Never once have I heard any kind of hypo like what I just said. It has not happened to the best of my knowledge. Not to say it couldn't, but it hasn't happened, right? So one, Bill Barr's reality does not exist. And two is what I am fighting for is the third option, right? I want a coach that huddles his kids up and says, okay, kids, it's the big game. I want you to practice like you play. I want you to go out there and play hard. And most of all, I want you to be good sports. Practice good sportsmanship, right? 1, 2, 3, break, go. That's a coach who's not abusing their power or their position or using the machinery of the state to impose their personal religion on anybody. That's a coach who's just doing their job. And that's what the separation of church and state should guarantee. It guarantees those kids the freedom to then go back home and talk to their parents or their friends about what might be true or not regarding the nature of the universe, to go talk to a member of the clergy or go pick up a book by Christopher Hitchens and read and learn. Right? That is the freedom that is guaranteed by the separation of church and state. That's what I'm fighting for every single day. That's what Americans United for Separation of Church and State is fighting for every single day. And that's what Bill Barr wants to rob us of. So I'm
All
ready.
right. I have about 20 more questions, but I know you're pressed for time. Can I ask you two more questions? One's
Sure,
one's a, one's a meaty one, and one is fairly short. All right. The
sure.
meaty question is, um, in Canada, we have essentially two versions of secularism, or two definitions. I alluded to this earlier. There's government neutrality in matters of religion. That's the one that I subscribe to, and then there's government separation, sort of the separation of church and state, which I think is the one that you defend so eloquently in your book. In one of our provinces, the government of Quebec passed a law, a religious symbols law. So government employees, including its teachers, cannot wear visible religious symbolism, and this has the greatest impact on Muslim women who are teachers. And under this law, they cannot wear the hijab while they are teaching. This is separate from proselytizing, which is illegal, and nobody argues with that. And this has split the Canadian secular society, secular community right down the middle, because there's the separationists who say that as a public school, government run, government funded, uh, no religious iconography should be permitted by the teachers at all, and that doing so is essentially a form of inculcation, or at least of government endorsement of the faith, and therefore the law is justified and a good thing, and if anything doesn't go far enough, but at least it's a good first step to make Quebec and Canada a more secular society. On the other side, um, there's many in the secular community who say government should not tell women or people what to wear, except you need to wear a helmet on a construction site. There's a health and safety reason for that, and if teachers want to wear something that doesn't impact their ability to um, uh, to do their job in an effective way, it'll live and let live. And I'm just wondering, from an outside perspective, uh, you know, what side of that debate would you fall on, at least from your perspective?
Well, I mean, the American perspective would probably say that they have a right to exercise their personal religious freedom up to a point, so long as it doesn't impose on other people's rights, right? And this is something that I talk about a lot in my latest book, American Crusade: How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom. I try to draw the lines that make it simple to understand what is religious freedom and when does your religious freedom end. And one of the sort of legal maxims that we have in this country is that your right to swing your fist ends at the other person's nose.
Right.
And I think you can use that very nicely when it comes to religious freedom. Your right to exercise your religious freedom ends where the rights of other people begin. So what you would have to make, the argument you would have to make there would be that it is somehow violating one of the rights of those children or those families to be exposed to this. Now, I do think a line that comes with religious freedom is the separation of church and state. And I talked about it a little bit in the hypo of the coach, right? Is that you do not get to co-opt the machinery of the state to promote your personal religion in any way, shape, or form. And so that is kind of where you're edging into here. That's where the question would be: is does wearing personal religious garb in your role as a teacher amount to promoting it using the machinery of the state? And then if so, where do you draw the line? Like, what about a yarmulke, right? Like, what about a crucifix hanging around somebody's neck, and where do we draw those lines? They're not always easy questions. I do think by and large, the questions of religious freedom are significantly easier to answer than we have made them out. Certainly in this country, and certainly that the Christian nationalists have made into kind of a deliberate quagmire in an effort to weaponize religious freedom and really truly make it into by saying weaponize, I mean a weapon that allows them to impose their personal religious beliefs on others. Though I don't think that's what you have happening in your case.
All right. Andrew Seidel, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you. I strongly recommend the Founding Myth for anyone that is interested in delving deeper. There's a lot in this book that we didn't get to cover today, and you can learn a lot. As I said, I've got one last question for you.
Yes.
How many basketballs does it take to fill the Grand Canyon?
Yes, an excellent question. So, for folks who don't know, I was a Grand Canyon tour guide for a while. I did this math, and the technically correct wording of the question is what's the volume of the whole, and what does that translate to in basketballs, because basketballs don't stack perfectly side by side. But do you want to take a guess?
No.
So
Because I don't know the size of the Grand Canyon, so I'm not even sure that I could that I'd be correct even to an order of magnitude or two.
well, nobody's ever gotten an order of magnitude close enough.
Okay, I would guess it would probably be on it would probably be 50 million.
Yeah, so you're not even close. It's 100 trillion, 200 billion. So you're
100 trillion.
way off. So,
Wow. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. All right, my friend, it has been a pleasure chatting with you. Go see the Grand Canyon.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, I need to. All right. Thank you very much. This has been great. Thank you for coming on Podcast for Inquiry.
My pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please show your support at patreon.com/podcast4inquiry and give us a 5-star review. Email us at podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, centerforinquiry.ca. We are on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter or X at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.